Hi, I'm Gareth Green, and in this video we're going to be thinking about how we might take the same melody and harmonise it in a major key or in its relative minor key. Now, you might be wondering why we're doing this. Actually, lots of people have asked me about this over the years. Sometimes you need to harmonise a melody and you look at the melody and you think, well, how do I know if the melody we're looking at now, for example, is in the key of G major or in the key of E minor? Well, often a clue is if you don't see any accidentals in the melody, apart from the key signature, it's normally telling us we're in G major. So we look at this melody, we think, well, if we've got an F sharp, we're in G major or we're in E minor. We can't see any accidentals along the way because if we saw a D sharp, for example, we'd be thinking, that's the raised 7th degree of the scale in the key of E minor. So that would be really flagging up E minor for us. We might see a C sharp because sometimes in a minor key we'll have a raised 6th degree of the scale. Actually, when you look at this melody, there isn't a C in it, there isn't a D in it. So we don't know whether the C's or the D's could be sharp if they were there or could be natural. So we've only got these notes to run with, but sometimes you have a melody that could be harmonized either way. And that's what we're going to think about here. So just a 2-bar, a 2-measure melody, nothing overexciting, but this is how the melody goes. Now you might hear that either in a major key or a minor key. And you might say, well, hang on, it starts on G, it finishes on G, surely it's in G major. And it certainly sounds perfectly well in G major. But consider the possibility that it might be in E minor. And then when you hear it that way, sounds perfectly good. Does one sound better than the other? Not particularly, though you might prefer one to the other. So it's just making this point that sometimes you have a melody or a portion of a melody, a phrase of a melody that might be harmonized in a major key or often its relative minor key. So let's just consider this for a moment, because on this page I've given a possible harmonization of this in the key of G major. Now, it's not the only way to harmonize this, because what I've just improvised a moment ago was much more straightforward. What I just did a minute ago was to put down a chord of G major for the whole of the first bar, the first measure. Because actually it's perfectly possible to do that. You can treat the G as a chord tone, a harmony note. This A is just a passing note or a passing tone. B fits the chord, A is passing, G fits the chord. So you could just do the whole of that first measure, that first bar, with a chord of G major if you wanted to keep it fairly simple and have the harmony moving quite slowly. When you come on to the second bar, the second measure, you look at A and F sharp and you think, well, if I'm in the key of G major, those two notes are either the 3rd and the 5th of a chord 5, a D major chord, or it's the root and the 3rd of a chord 7, and that's an F sharp diminished chord. So maybe that's slightly less successful as a choice, especially as we are about to have a cadence at this point. So is it better to go 7 to 1 or F sharp diminished to G, or is it better to go D to G, 5 to 1? I think probably 5 to 1. So perfectly possible to treat the whole of the first bar, the first measure, as a chord 1 at the G chord, to have these two beats as a D chord, a chord 5, and then come back to chord 1, the G chord. Sounds perfectly right. Now, say you want to do something a little bit more inventive with a harmony than that. Well, here's a version that I've put together. What does this sound like? Okay, now I've tried to notate all of that down below. So what have I done here? I've started on chord 1 or a G chord. Kind of makes sense if you're in G major, if it's the first chord especially. And then, you know, we could have changed when we moved to this note, and we could have said, well, it could have been a chord 6, an E minor chord, but there's no harm in sticking with the same chord there. And if you want to avoid it feeling as if it's a bit stuck, you know, if I just go 1, 1, or G, G, something as simple as this little trick of the bass leaping an octave means that you've got the same chord, but you've got some movement in there. So there's an idea. Okay, and then I've thought here about the fact that we might use a chord 2, because the chord 1s are major chords, chord 2s are minor chords, so that's a nice bit of variety. And also it's going to give us a nice bass line if we can do this little trick about starting in chord 1 there, moving up to chord 2, and then effectively that's a 1B chord. Sorry, that should actually say B at that point, so I'll just scribble that in there. Okay, so that will be a 1 in first inversion. Do you see what's quite neat about going 1, 2, 1B, or 1, 6, you might know that as 1 in first inversion, is the melody is going B, A, G, while the bass is in the opposite. You know, so you've got B, A, G there, and you've got G, A, B in the bass. So the fact that they're running the same 3 notes in contrary motion makes for good kind of movement between the outer parts, and it stops you writing consecutive fifths, parallel octaves, consecutive octaves. So it's quite a useful way of doing things. So that's why the first bar I decided to start on chord 1, have 1 with the bass leaping to go through chord 2 and on to chord 1 in first inversion. So I think that gives you a nice progression in the first bar. It's not the only way to do it at all. As I say, you could have gone from 1 to 6. You could even have gone from 1 to 3. So G to E minor, that's 6, or G to B minor, that's 3. All these are possibilities. But I decided to keep the first 2 chords strong, keeping them on chord 1 and having that leaping bass. And you can see that I've also just spruced it up a little bit, a passing note there, or a passing tone, and a little decoration here as well. Now, I just want to talk about this little decoration, because some people will be saying, hang on a moment, you can't do that. That's not a passing note or a passing tone, because it's not passing anywhere by step. You might be saying, it's not an upper auxiliary note or an upper neighbour tone, because it's not coming back to the previous note. Absolutely. But that F sharp in the alto part there is implying another chord. And that other chord is a 7B chord. So we talked about this a moment ago, this chord 7, F sharp A C, or the F sharp diminished chord. Those chords, those diminished chords, often work much better in first inversion. So what actually happens on this beat is that effectively you start with this chord 2 and it sort of changes to that chord 7 in first inversion. So it's another little trick. You know, this feels as if it's imitating this passing note, passing tone, which in turn is imitating that one. But actually, just because it's a quaver or an eighth note doesn't mean it has to be the same kind of note. And in this case, it's a way of just keeping some movement going and just sort of tweaking a chord. So you've got your A minor chord, and then by tucking in this note, it just changes the flavour of the chord a bit. Anyway, we finished that measure on 1B, 1/6, or G/B as I've put it down there. So you've got this sort of lead sheet style as well. And then in the second bar, I've just gone for an A minor/C chord, or an A minor in first inversion, which could be a 2B or a 2/6, depending on which part of the world you're in. So that's what's going on at the first beat of this measure. And then I've got a passing note in the tenor, going on to a chord 5 or a D chord. And then you notice I've got another little quaver, an eighth note in there. That's not going by step, so it can't be a passing note, a passing tone. It can't be an auxiliary note or a neighbour tone. But what it's doing is that C is converting this chord 5 or this D chord into a 7th. So it becomes a 5/7 or a D7 and then finishes on the tonic chord of G major. So now we've really got G major wired in our minds, haven't we? But let's look at the next page. Here's the same melody in E minor. Just showing you that it's perfectly possible to do this in E minor. And how do we know we're in E minor? Well, we immediately see that we have now got some D sharps, that raised 7th degree of the scale going on in the lower part. So that's helping us to think E minor. And just as we said a moment ago that, well, if it starts on G and it finishes on G, surely it's a chord of G or a chord 1 in G major. But remember that G is also the 3rd of chord 1 in E minor, or the 3rd of an E minor chord. So just because you've got G with a G major chord, there's nothing to say that G won't go with an E minor chord. So I could do something again that's simpler than the thing I've written down. The whole of the first bar could be an E minor chord. And we'd be treating those notes just as we did before. So harmony, passing, harmony, passing, harmony. And then in the second bar, the second measure, I could just have a dominant 7th or a B7 and then finish off on that E minor chord, chord 1. But I've tried to do something a little more interesting. Okay, so what have I done? Well, I've started on chord 1, the E minor chord, and then this time, because we had that passing note, that passing tone there, I was thinking, well, we could kind of have one of those in the bass as well, so we could have a double passing tone, a double passing note, especially because a soprano and the bass this time are going in similar motion, but they're effectively a third apart, a compound third apart. So it's quite nice to run them as a pair. And I've kind of carried that on. So running in thirds or sixths, often a good way to do things. Okay, and then that means that it kind of takes me on to chord 1 again, but this time I'm using chord 1 in first inversion, so an E minor / G chord. Remember when I was in G major, I just used chord 1 followed by chord 1. And I said, well, we could have changed the chord. The other possibility is use the same chord, but change the inversion. So that's what I've done here. I've gone from 1, the E minor chord, double passings, to 1 in first inversion. So same chord, but different inversion. Then I thought, well, let's spruce things up when we come to beat 3. So we've got this chord. This is a rather nice chord, isn't it? So that's a 2/7 chord. So I'm using an extension chord there. So you see how that works out. It's an F sharp diminished chord with a 7th on it. And then what am I doing with these 8th notes, these quavers in the second half of that beat? Well, all that's happening in the tenor part is that I'm hopping to effectively another note of the chord. You could say that what I'm doing here with this D sharp is using a lower auxiliary note or a lower neighbor tone, because I was E, I've come down a note, I've come back to E. So that qualifies in that way. Or you could say again, well, the kind of chord may have changed in the second half. So we start that with a 2/7. And then when we go there, well, we're back using this 7B chord again, this 7 in first inversion. So there's a sort of, it could be treated in more than one way, that. So I'm just trying to show that that possibility exists, depending on how you view a situation in terms of, are you using chord tones or harmony notes, or are you using inessential notes or non-chord tones? That's one way of seeing things. Sometimes you can say, actually, the chord changed. So you could see them all as chord tones or harmony notes. And that's one of those examples, really. And then we come back to chord 1, the E minor chord. Then as we go into the next bar, the second measure, I'm going for chord 4, or an A minor chord, followed by chord 5, the B major chord, back to chord 1, an E minor chord. So this is really just to give you a little bit of courage with this. When you meet these situations where you think, help, here's a phrase, I don't know whether I should harmonize this in G major or in E minor, or in any major key or its relative minor key, because both are possible. Fine, if both are possible, you can make your choice. What you might decide to do is look at what comes before this phrase, if something does, and look at what comes after it and think, well, would it make more sense to be in G major here because the next phrase is in E minor, rather than have both of them in E minor? You know, you're going to look at context and decide how that helps you. So just showing you how the same melody can sometimes work superbly well, whether it's in the major key or its relative minor. So here's the G major version we did. And here's the E minor version. So I hope that's been helpful. If it's useful and you want to go a bit further with this, you may just want to go to our website, www.mmcourses.co.uk, click on courses and have a look at our keyboard harmony course, especially if you're a keyboard player and you're sort of thinking, I just want to get really good at doing all this kind of stuff, because there's a course there that really takes you from A to Z in being able to think out chords and harmony, but to do it very practically under your fingers. Lots of other stuff on the website, but that might be a particular course that's useful to you.